Hello, everybody. Welcome to Books and Bridges, a humanities institute of ideas and conversation. As part of our series on ethical schools of thought, tonight we enter a world in many ways more vast and intricate than the ethical and religious spaces we inhabit in the West. The Hindu sacred text called the Upanishads is at once a dazzling multiplicity as well as a coherent unity. By opening ourselves to a different worldview, our own lives become enriched. We are fortunate to have Ravi M. Gupta as our guest. Dr. Gupta is the Charles Redd Professor of Religious Studies and Department Head of History, Religious Studies, and Classics at Utah State University. He received his MA and PhD from Oxford University. Dr. Gupta is the author or editor of 4 books, including an abridged translation of the Bhagavata Purana with Kenneth Valpe, published by Columbia University Press. Ravi has received 4 teaching awards, a National Endowment for the Humanities Summer Fellowship, 3 research fellowships, and a book award. He is a permanent research fellow of the Oxford Center for Hindu Studies and a past president of the Society for Hindu Christian Studies. Ravi, thank you for being with us. We're excited to hear your presentation. And there will be a question and answer session afterwards. So keep that in mind as you think about what he says and prepare questions to ask him. So I turn the time over to you, Ravi.
Thank you, Nathan. Thank you so much for inviting me to speak a few words this evening. I know I've attended or spoken for Books and Bridges in the past, and I've always enjoyed the space that you've created here for discussion and dialogue. I wish we could be there in person and talk and converse and have a bite to eat together, but this Zoom format is also beneficial in many ways because it allows us to reach people who otherwise wouldn't be here in Utah or in Logan or in Salt Lake City. So it has its pros and cons, and I'm certainly grateful that for the people who have come and for this opportunity to say a few words. I'll try to keep my comments short and then have plenty of time for discussion because the topic is suitably vast and with a vast topic it really it's better to go in places where listeners and fellow seekers want to go, rather than try to cover everything in the space of a few minutes. So I'm going to give some introductory remarks, show you a few passages to sort of frame the discussion, and then we will we'll open it up to discussion. So ethical systems based on the Upanishads is the topic. And I wanted to start by reading, so the Upanishads are a collection of sacred texts from India that go all the way back to 600 BCE, and then in the centuries afterwards, from a historical perspective, for the tradition itself, the Upanishads are eternal. They're apaurushaya, which means they have no human origin in history, and so they are simply revealed and hidden in due course of time over and over again through the cycles of history. So, but one way or the other, they've served as a very foundational collection of texts from India that have really shaped Hindu thought, culture, religion, and lifestyle. And so there's so much that one could explore in the Upanishads, and so much one could say about the ethical foundations that the Upanishads provide. So there's a lot there. They're beautiful works, and I say collection of works in the plural because the Upanishads are not a single text. They're a collection of texts. In fact, they're a genre of literature. When most people speak of the Upanishads, they speak of about a dozen or so, actually 13 is the standard number, Upanishads that are called the early Upanishads, They're the oldest ones that we have, and they've become standard or canonical for many different Hindu traditions. But the genre of Upanishadic writing continues well after that into history. And there are many, many Upanishads. But like I said, about a dozen or so are the most important ones that people refer to when they speak of the Upanishads. Now, I want to start by reading just two sentences from the Chandogya Upanishad, chapter 6. And this is one of the early Upanishads. It's probably, so chapter 6 of the Chandogya, I would say, is the most famous passage in all the Upanishads. If we look at it from a contemporary perspective, but also in the past several centuries, this chapter has been really, really important and very famous, and we'll see why in just a moment. But before I show you the text here, the passage begins, as so many Upanishadic passages do, in the context of a conversation. It's a dialogue. The Upanishads are not, tracts of philosophy. They're not essays. They are dialogues between teachers and students, or between parents and children. And in this case, we have a father and a son. The father sends the son off to school at the house of a guru or a teacher to live there for 12 years and get all his basic schooling. And he's the son of a Brahmin or a priest. And the son comes back, the text says, all swell-headed and arrogant and full of himself, because he is, after all, now has a degree in our modern terms, and letters after his name. So he comes swell-headed, and his father, seeing this, asks him a couple of simple questions that are deceptively simple questions about philosophy. And his son has no answer to those questions. He says, "Have you learned about this?" And his son says, "No." The son's name is Shvetaketu. And so to his son's credit, despite his arrogance, he wants to learn. And so he turns to his father and says, "Sir, you teach me, because I don't know what you're talking about." And so it's in that context that this dialogue begins. And it starts in a simple yet profound way. So you should be able to see a text now that says Chandogya Upanishad on the top, and it gives you the verse number here. I apologize for the rather sketchy scan I've got here, but hopefully you can read. We're not going to read too much here. So we've got the intro story, and then he starts his instruction like this. In the beginning, son, this world was simply what is existent, one only, without a second. So I'm just going to start with that sentence here. In the beginning, son, this world was simply what is existent, one only, without a second. Now, that is a very profound statement of unity, of oneness. Everything that existed began as one in the beginning. Now, for some people like me who come from the Hindu tradition, this can seem like a very boring and obvious statement. We all came from one source. In fact, I think for people who come from monotheistic traditions, it can also be a very obvious sort of statement. And yet the statement is anything but obvious, right? There is no reason to suppose just off the bat that everything comes from one place, that our origin is singular in nature, and not only is it singular, but the substance that we all share is the same. And this is sort of the starting point and the foundation of the Upanishads, is the idea that each one of us is an individual spiritual self, different from the body and different from all those things that introduce differences between us. So whether I consider myself black or white or man or woman or rich or poor or ugly or beautiful, these are all labels that we place upon ourselves that do not reach, that do not have anything to do with our inner spiritual self. That is called the Atma. And that spiritual self that's present in me is also present in every other individual. Not the same self necessarily, but the same kind of spiritual self is present in everyone, every form of life. In fact, not just every human being is an Atma, is a spiritual self, but every other living species as well, whether they be animals, plants, or anything else that is living. So every living thing in this world shares that eternal nature, also shared by God, if we use a theistic term, or by ultimate reality, Brahman. So we all share, we participate in that spiritual quality. And the quality of the spiritual self is three things: eternity, awareness or knowledge, and bliss. So these three characteristics, eternity, awareness and bliss, consciousness and bliss, these are the characteristics of the self, of the Atma. There is no beginning, no end. We are eternal. We are conscious, we're aware. That's fundamentally what the difference between us and a, bottle of water is, that the bottle of water is not conscious of itself. It doesn't have the capacity to feel pleasure or pain. But every living thing does. From an animal to a plant, everything struggles to survive, struggles to flourish, has a sense of self. And that reflexive consciousness is the marker of the soul, of the Atma, of the spirit. So that sense of profound unity leads in very practical ways to various ethical principles that have their germination in the Upanishads and then develop into very important pillars of ethics in Hinduism. The first has to do with the idea of karma, or the idea that whatever I put out into the world will come back to me. Right? Now, when we recognize, so karma is a term that is widely used now in our own culture, and people, use it in various ways. It's become quite a popular term, but it's grounded in this idea that it's not that it's just like a bounce back sort of thing, where if you throw a ball against a wall, it'll bounce back at you. There is that sense, there is sort of a response from the world, but it's really something more profound. It's recognizing that the reason, when I put good into the world, I will get good back. If I put something negative or evil into the world, I will get that back. And the reason for that is because when I'm putting good into the world, I'm applying that goodness to myself, right? Everyone in this world, because we share in the same reality, the idea of someone who's completely other to me falls apart very quickly, right? So if I walk up to Nathan and punch him in the face, I can expect a negative response, right? I mean, Nathan is a nice enough person where he might laugh it off and he might, not punch me back, but our relationship will be affected, don't you think? It's
try
it. So it's going to be affected in some way, and the reason for that is not just because, it's not just because I did something bad and I deserve something bad in return. It's not merely a punishment scenario. So this is not just about me being judged. It's about the fact that even if Nathan doesn't give me a reaction, someone will, right? The pain that I gave him, I will experience at some point in my journey through this world. Why? Because I gave that pain to myself in the ultimate sense, right? It will come back because it hasn't gone anywhere. We all share in that same reality, right? Pure otherness is a very foreign concept to the Upanishads. So the notion of karma is crucial, and it's born from this sense. Another thing that's tied very closely to that is the idea of ahimsa, or nonviolence. Literally, ahimsa means non-injury to others. And again, this is something that extends not just to the human family, but to all different species and forms of life. There's no justification for gratuitous harm in the world, for unnecessary harm. This manifests in physical ways, such as vegetarianism, for example, where of all countries in the world, and there's been a lot of studies done, India has the largest proportion of vegetarians. This is an ethical principle that's shared across Hinduism, Buddhism, Jainism, Sikhism, the traditions, the religious traditions born in India, and that trace their origins back to the same period as the Upanishads. So not all of them come from the Upanishads, but the Upanishads are born at a time when there's a real grappling with suffering. The Upanishads, in fact, are born in response to an earlier form of ritual called the Vedas. And the Vedas were a sacrificial religion that were, that involved offering animals in sacrifice in a fire ritual, in a fire ceremony to the gods. And it was those sorts of animal sacrifices that prompted, it was one of the things that prompted a response in the form of the Upanishads, where the Upanishads and Buddhism also around the same time basically asked the question, how can something good, beneficial, salutary possibly come from shedding someone else's blood? Right? How can that process, when you give pain to another, how can that produce something good? And conversely, when we offer goodness to another, we can expect that elevates not just me, but the entire world altogether. There's a beautiful section in the Upanishads where a husband, Yajnavalkya, is speaking to his wife and says, what a husband loves when he loves his wife is the self, right? It's not the physical body itself, but the person within. When the person passes away, we know that person is gone. The body is in the ground or it's consigned to the flames. But the person, it's the person we love, and we continue to love that person, the Atma, the self. So Ahimsa becomes a very important principle that emerges from this idea in the Upanishads. I remember as a child, I still remember the first time I saw someone at school crush a spider. It was the most unthinking, normal thing for that child to do. See a spider, crush it. And for me, it just like, it was in that moment, it was momentarily horrifying. Because up to that point, I had never thought of the possibility of snuffing out a life just because it existed, right? There was no danger there, there was no harm there, there was no potential problem. It was a daddy long leg or something like that. It was just, it existed. And it wasn't meant to exist in someone's eyes. And so that life was snuffed out. And to this day, even as the box elder bugs attack me in my office here at USU, I can't, help but cover them with a cup or pick them up or take them outside to the hallway or out a window, just because it's such a deeply ingrained idea that life itself is so deeply unified that harming another person goes against the very grain of the universe itself. Now, the reality, of course, is that this ethic, like any ethical system, hasn't played out perfectly and beautifully. Far from it. There's a huge gap. There's a huge gap between principle and practice. And this is sadly the reality of the world, right? If we all lived up to our ideals, in this series that you're examining such a grand series of great ethical systems, each one of them wonderful and powerful, and they cover the world, these ethical systems, right? Everyone in the world has been touched by one or more of the ethical systems that you are encountering in this series with Books and Bridges. And yet, the challenge, of course, is that not all of us live by the ethical systems that we aspire to. And so Hindus have fallen short of Upanishadic ideals in many different ways. Perhaps the most visible and egregious being the caste system, which goes against that very principle of oneness and unity that I've been articulating for the past 15 minutes or so. Now, and we can discuss that further if anyone's interested. But if I were to stop my talk here, I would be doing a grave injustice to the Upanishadic system, because unity or oneness is only half the story. The Upanishads begin with a notion of unity, but of oneness, but that is only half. And the reason for that is because they quite explicitly state, the Chandogya, the Brihadaranyaka, that although unity is a principle of existence and of origin, there's no joy in oneness. Joy is a product of relationship, of having someone else. They say explicitly that the original person, the first person, was alone, and there was no joy being alone. And so, because of that fact, because of the fact that happiness, joy is born in relationship with others, therefore the Upanishads, as soon as they speak of unity, they move in the next moment to affirming multiplicity, to affirming diversity. Because if we crush everything into a unity, we commit harm just by that very fact, right? We wipe away the differences and the uniquenesses that make this world a place full of variety and of enjoyment and pleasure and relationship and engagement. And so, going back to that passage, if we skip down just a little bit, then the second sentence I want to read is this one. So in the beginning, there was only the existent, one only without a second. But it thought to itself, let me become many, let me propagate myself. So while affirming a common origin and a common identity, the Upanishads move immediately to the idea, let me become many, let me propagate myself. And the text goes on then to describe how that multiplicity is born and introduced. But this second aspect of multiplicity is just as crucial as the idea of unity. Because in multiplicity, we have the possibility of relationship. And in relationship, we have the possibility of joy, of progress, of growth, personal growth, of kindness and compassion to others, of self-control, all these other virtues require the presence of others, right? And so the nature of the world is such that it's full of variety. And the Upanishads never try to deny or collapse or destroy that variety. Multiplicity is part of the very fabric of the universe. It's not an annoying anomaly to be explained or to be explained away. So sometimes, to give you a very stark illustration of this, sometimes we, in our own environment and culture, have the tendency to think that the more important something is, the less of it there must be, right? So the rarer it must be, the fewer. And in things that are the most important, there's going to be only one. So because God is the most important person, there must be only one God. Because scripture is the most important book, there must be only one book. Since religion is the most important human engagement, there has to be only one true religion, et cetera, et cetera. But the Upanishads push back against that. The Hindu tradition as a whole pushes back against that in very strong ways, to say that in fact the opposite might be true. That the more important something is, the more of it there should be. The more of it we should expect. So if truth is the most important thing that we can strive for, then we should expect that truth to be visible and manifest and apparent in many different places, in all different places, in fact. Perhaps it presents itself in different forms or different packages, in different shapes, but it must present itself in some way because it is truth. It is the most important, right? Even when it comes to the divine, to God, the Upanishads affirm a monotheism, the idea of one supreme reality, one supreme deity. And yet, as soon as they say that, they, within the same breath, they emphasize that that one supreme reality shows its face in multiple ways, and in fact, in limitless forms and limitless ways. For me personally, this has been a very important guiding ethical principle in my own life, to try to not treat multiplicity as an anomaly, as a problem to be explained. If truth is one, why are there so many religions? That phrases the issue as a problem, right? But rather to say, no, multiplicity is where we start. That's the ground of existence. In fact, if there is only one of something, I have to be concerned about that. That's a problem. Why is there only one of this? Why is this truth only recognized by one person, one community, one religion, one nationality? That seems to be a problem, right? To reverse the discussion, to reverse the problem, to point to oneness as a problem rather than multiplicity as a problem. And so, you know, in times of, I come from a devotional, a theistic tradition within Hinduism, of the Vaishnava tradition, which holds reverence for God by the name of Krishna, right? And in my own faith journey, in times when I have struggled with my faith, with conviction, what has strengthened my faith is to look out into the world and see that that same truth is held in different ways by other traditions that are so different than my own. And that gives me a sense of relief and a sense of confidence that, okay, what I am asked to place my faith in is not crazy, it's not unusual, it's not odd. This is something that is shared across the human family. It's something that is deep. It is truth in that it manifests itself in multiple ways, in multiple times, places, circumstances, locations. And that's always been a source of encouragement for me, a source of strengthening in times of faith crisis or faith worry. Now, this idea of multiplicity also is the source of some other very important principles that the Upanishads teach, particularly the idea of moderation and simplicity. The recognition that there's always more than you. There's always multiple people involved. There's always multiple concerns that are present. Pushes the Upanishads and those who read it to recognize that there are limits to what I can claim as my own in this world. In fact, very severe limits. We come into this world holding nothing. Our fists are open, they are empty. And when we leave this world, we leave with our hands open and empty. We take nothing with us. And so we arrive in this world as tenants, as passengers. We ride the train of life. We get on at a particular station, and we're asked to get off the train at another station and catch another train to our next destination. But that train is not ours. We don't drive it. The world flows past us. We're simply passengers in that journey. And so the Isha Upanishad, another beautiful work, beautiful one of the Upanishads, has this very famous verse, which I committed to memory as a child many, many years ago. It goes like this. Isha vasyam idam sarvam yat kincha jagatyam jagat tena tyaktena bhunjitha ma gridha kasya swidhanam. Everything in this world is pervaded and possessed by the Lord. Isha vasyam idam sarvam. And therefore, knowing that, one should only take what is their share and not more, knowing well to whom all of this actually belongs. And just before that verse actually comes a very, very beautiful statement of unity. So you'll see how this unity and multiplicity come together. Just before the verse I quoted, there's another one, which is one of my favorites. It goes, Om Purnamada Purnamidam Purnat Purnamudachyate Purnasya Purnamadaya Purnameva Vashishyate. Even if you don't know Sanskrit, you probably heard that one word repeated over and over again. Purnam. Purnamada Purnamidam Purnat Purnam Udachyate. Purna means complete or whole. This world is whole. It's complete. This is whole, that is whole. This, me, my world, that, you, your world. This is whole, that is whole. Everything is complete. And if we take the whole from the whole, what is left behind is still whole. In other words, a sense of wholeness that is also endless. And just after that statement of unity, the next verse introduces the idea of multiplicity and says, because everything is whole and because we are all connected, take what is appropriate for you and not more. Don't covet what belongs to another. So, unity, multiplicity. These two things are in a constant interplay. in the Upanishads. One leads to the other. When you're discussing unity, it'll lead to multiplicity. When you're talking about multiplicity, unity is going to follow shortly thereafter. And the Upanishads exist within that paradox of unity in diversity. I want to end by reading one parable from the Upanishads. And it's Nathan, I'm going to need your help since I need a reading partner.
Sure.
Let's see here. Whoops. So this is, whoops, I went too far. Okay. So the father continues with his son in the same chapter, and he gives a variety of metaphors that speak to this, what I've been discussing. And we'll just read two. They're both short, 12 and 13. So Nathan, I will be the father and you be the son. Okay, Shweta Ketu.
Yes, Father.
So here we go. Bring a banyan fruit.
Here it is, sir.
Cut it up.
I've cut it up, sir.
What do you see there?
These quite tiny seeds, sir.
Now take one of them and cut it up.
I've cut one up, sir.
What do you see there?
Nothing, sir.
This finest essence here, son, that you can't even see. Look how on account of that finest essence, this huge banyan tree stands here. Believe, my son, the finest essence here, that constitutes the self of this whole world. That is the truth. That is the self, Atma. And that's how you are, Shweta Ketu.
Sir, teach me more.
Very well, son. Put this chunk of salt in a container of water and come back tomorrow. So the son did as he was told, and the father said to him, the chunk of salt you put in the water last evening, bring it here. And now, Nathan, you grope for it, but you cannot find it because the salt had dissolved. Now, take a sip from this corner of this water. How does it taste?
Salty.
Take a sip from the center. How does it taste?
Salty.
Take a sip from that corner. How does it taste?
Salty.
Throw it out and come back later. And Nathan does as he's told. And when he throws the salt onto a rock or whatever he does, the water evaporates. And what do you see there after the evaporation?
The finest essence here.
Yeah.
Oh, that's you.
Sorry, one more thing. The father told him, you of course did not, throw it out, come back later. He did as he was told and found that the salt was always there. The father told him, you of course did not see it there, son, yet it was always right there. The finest essence here, that constitutes the self of this whole world. That is the truth. That is the self, Atma. And that's how you are, Shweta Ketu.
Sir, teach me more.
Not today, son. So
Oh.
think about that salt, right? The salt goes, he dissolves the salt in the water. It becomes one. And yet, when you throw the salt onto the ground, it's always there. That multiplicity, that difference between the salt and the water is never actually dissolved, is it? It's always present. That difference is present. But we can know that essence by experiencing it in our own lives. So I'll stop there because I want to leave enough time for questions and discussion. There's so much more that I could talk about. There's another passage I wanted to share also, but we'll do that if the questions lead us there. I'll pause here. I've already gone over my time. So thank you again for this opportunity, Nathan. And I'm eager to hear what our webinar audience has to ask and say.
Well, thank you very much, Ravi. This is a wealth of wisdom and reflection insight that I think will stick with us for a long time. I think we're all Hindu now, right? What is there to object? Well, let me start with a question, then I can open it up to everyone else. I like the universe, the cosmos that is painted in this vision. But let me just ask: is it an open universe that is proliferating, expanding, or is it somehow finite? Does the universe that kind of expresses itself through individuals, is it always growing outwards, or does it kind of circle around? That makes sense. In other words, does the human being have limitless potential?
Yeah, that's a good question, and the answer is both. So the Hindu understanding of the universe is, and here I'm generalizing, of course, but to speak broadly, the Hindu understanding of the way the cosmos runs is very much cyclical. It moves in cycles, right? The world expands and contracts. It's created and then dissolved, just like in the salt metaphor, right? The salt is dissolved and then it's visible again. Then it's dissolved again, it's visible again. This is a process that repeats itself. But it's not like Groundhog Day. It's not that we're going around the same experiences over and over. We go around the same point, but each time higher and higher with new perspective, and hopefully working our way to moksha, or to liberation. So I like to think of it as a spiral, not as a circle, but as a spiral, where a spiral is moving around the same point over and over again, but each time higher and higher and higher. We're expanding our understanding, our consciousness, our abilities, all of that. Or, unfortunately, sometimes we're going down as well.
And does the individual decide the pace and the direction of their progression?
Yes, that's the very foundation of the notion of karma, right? The notion of karma is fundamentally about the idea that we shape our future by the actions that we do today, by the consciousness that we create for ourselves today, that we make to the degree that we have choice in this world, which is not a limitless choice by any means, right? It's quite a limited range of choices that we're provided, given our past and our circumstances and the family we're born in and all of those things. But we do have some. And given how we utilize the set of tools that we're given when we come into this world, will shape my future and where I go next. And that's the foundation of the idea of karma.
Thanks. So Carson has a question. When you use the word truth, for example, multiple truths, how are you defining it approximately?
When I use sorry, got cut off there. When I use what?
When you use the word truth, how are you defining it?
Okay, so that's a great question, Carson. Thank you for asking that. And thank you for being here. What's very interesting in the Upanishads and the Bhagavad Gita is that the word for truth is exactly the same word as reality. You can translate any instance of the word truth in the Upanishads, you can translate as reality and vice versa. So the word sat means reality and it means truth, or reality, existence, it means truth. Tattva, another word, means reality, it means truth. So the idea of a ethical notion of truth is not divorced from the ontological notion of truth, right? And I know these terms are a little technical, but I think this is something important to keep in mind, that in the Upanishads, you cannot separate the ethical system from the metaphysical system. And the linchpin of that is the notion of truth as we see it, being honest, being fully present in the world, and reality as in that which exists is exactly the same thing. So when I speak of truth, I'm speaking of, in Upanishadic terms, I'm speaking of reality. And what that means is that truth is simply that which is. And anytime we are faced with something that is real, It's real because we have experienced it, or perhaps it's real because others have experienced it, or it's real because it's something we cannot run away from, or it's real because it's logical, or it's real because it is a truth that is provided to us from reliable sources. If it's real, then it's true. Truth is simply that which is, right? That which is existent. And so it's a very, very broad understanding of truth in terms of that is born from, and there's different ways of arriving at that. So there's three primary ways that the Vedantic or the Upanishadic tradition articulates as ways of arriving at the truth. Through pratyaksha, which is our own experience, our sensual experience. I can see things, I can hear things. Anumana, which is reason or logic, inference. So I can't see, how big the sun is, but I can make an inference based on the fact that it's a certain distance and therefore it must be a certain size. I can use my powers of logic, mathematics, reason. And then the third is Shabda, which is revelation, but also more generally reliable testimony. When we receive knowledge from a reliable source. So I have never experienced China. And so from my own experience, I cannot say it exists. But from reliable sources, sources that I have experienced as reliable, I understand, I believe that China is a place that exists, right? So through reliable testimony, through reason and logic, and through direct experience, these are three valid means of knowing things in the world, of arriving at what is real and therefore what is true.
Does the end point of a soul's journey maintain its individuation, or does it kind of dissolve back into the whole?
You have just stepped into one of the biggest controversies in the tradition that emerges from the Upanishads. So the Upanishads give birth to an entire philosophical system that has been the most powerful philosophical system in India for over 1,000 years. And that philosophical system is full of debates, but the major debate centers on this very question. Do we place the accent on oneness or on multiplicity, right? In a paradoxical system, some people are not willing to live in the paradox, and they want to emphasize one side or the other as more foundational than the other side. And there is a major tradition in the Upanishads that says that upon achieving liberation or moksha, your identity is gone, it's dissolved. It's not exactly dissolved, you just recognize that there wasn't ever an individual to start with. They are radical monists. They believe in one reality. And then there are others who are radical non-dualists or dualists who argue that difference or multiplicity is the foundational reality of this world, that oneness is not substantial, that what's real is the fact that we are individual with differences. I belong to a tradition that attempts to live in the center of the paradox, to say that both oneness and difference in substance have to be affirmed and held together. And even if that is paradoxical, and even if that is confusing and inconceivable, that is the mystery that defines our existence. And we have to exist in that mystery. We have to hold it. Because if we emphasize one over the other, we lose something very valuable. If I emphasize unity and devalue difference, I lose all the variety and relationship that comes with love, with joy, with kindness, because there is no one else to love and to be kind to. And in contrast, if I affirm difference and I reject unity, then there's nothing in common between me and you. I truly am divorced from fellow human beings. I truly cannot understand or appreciate your existence because we have nothing in common, right? So the tradition I belong to says we have to live in that paradox. And it's a metaphysical, ontological, and epistemological paradox, right? It's something that it's a paradox of knowing, it's a paradox of existing, and it's an ethical paradox as well, as we've been discussing.
Yeah, that makes sense to me, because choosing one way or the other, choosing unity or multiplicity as excluding the other, would kind of assume a finite reason that we may only have in this state of existence. Who knows if other states of existence could move beyond, you know, the capacities, the rational capacities that we have now. So
yeah,
well, live in the paradox. That's bold of you. We have a question from Annalisa. Are all of the Upanishads written in dialogue form? How does this form style speak to the function of the philosophy?
That's a beautiful question, Annalisa. That's just wonderful. A big part of the Upanishads' message is its form, is the medium that it uses. There's many things that come with the Upanishads' teaching style. They are always dialogical. And the key thing there, well, I shouldn't say all, because there are sections that are monologues, but they're rare. The Upanishads are typically dialogical. And the reason for that is because the Upanishads' teachings are always student-driven. These are typically dialogues between teachers and students, sometimes between peers, but it's the person who wants to know who drives the discussion. There's very little in the Upanishads of the teacher saying, this is what you need to know, and so now I shall teach you. It's always the teacher saying, I want to know about this. Can you teach me? As we saw in the dialogue that we just read together. That in modern terms, we would call this student-driven learning. That's a term, of course, that's very recent, but the Upanishads, there's a sense in which they are driven by the questioners. In fact, it's so unusual for a teacher to start with an agenda and then sort of download the information that when it does happen, the commentators find themselves compelled to try to explain that anomaly. Like, why is this happening here? This is so unusual. So the dialogue is very important to what the Upanishads have to say about the nature of knowledge itself, that how knowledge is produced. Number one, knowledge is born in relationship. Knowledge is born in relationship. It is not a, it's not a download of information, right? From an Upanishadic perspective, the vast amounts of information we have on the internet would not constitute even a shred of knowledge. They would be information, they would be data, and there's nothing wrong with information, there's nothing wrong with data, but it's not knowledge. Knowledge, in the words of a later text, is reality distinguished from illusion for the welfare of all. Reality distinguished from illusion, we've talked about that extensively, what reality is and so on. But it's the second part that I want to focus on in answer to Annalisa's question, is for the welfare of all, right? There's a relational element there. There's an ethics is baked into knowledge. There is no knowledge divorced from ethics. The idea of saying, I discovered this technology or piece of information, I throw it out into the world and people do with it what they want. That idea is anathema to the Hindu tradition. If there is knowledge, true knowledge or wisdom comes with the responsibility to ethically apply that knowledge, to know what its consequences are, to know how it will cause the welfare of others or not, right? And so that element that's what's embedded in the idea of dialogue, that knowledge is fundamentally born of relationship, and there's an ethical component to knowledge that must always be kept in mind. Secondly, the Upanishads always teach experientially. The teacher teaches the student by asking them to do something, to see something, to experience something, just like we saw here. Cut up the banyan seed, dissolve the salt in the water, right? Knowledge in the Upanishads is dialogical, but also experiential, where the teacher is always asking the student to experience certain things, to accomplish certain things, do certain things. And from that process, knowledge is born. Great question.
Any other questions? I have a question if no one else does.
Sure.
When I listen to you speak, what strikes me is how the conversation is operating on these two different kind of wavelengths or scales. One is the cosmic and one is the internal of the individual. And so the cosmic, shapes the individual experience. And one thing that really strikes me is to see the point of departure from, say, the way that the Christian world, the way that Christianity views the world as being kind of fractured in a way that needs a recompense. It needs to be redeemed. It's broken, and a sacrifice is necessary to kind of to recompense that loss. But it's very interesting that in the universe that you described, the universe is self-regulating and whole in such a way that it does not require sacrifice. I think that's very interesting in terms of comparing Christianity and Hinduism. What do you think about that?
Yeah, so you make a very interesting point, Nathan, I think you've pinpointed one of the kind of foundational differences between many forms of Christianity and many forms of Hinduism, being the idea, the sense that the brokenness of the world on one hand, and the brokenness of human nature on the one hand, and the wholeness of the world and the wholeness of human nature on the other. Now, that's very true. That picture is slightly muddied by the fact that there is still a problem with the world in the Hindu tradition. So the human condition is still very much real. That problem is characterized not so much by brokenness and by evil, but by ignorance, right? So it's not that the world, by saying that the world is whole doesn't mean that everything's fine and dandy. Quite to the contrary. The Upanishad, Hinduism, just like with Buddhism, begins with the idea that we have a problem, that the world is a place of suffering, and there's an issue here, right? So in that sense, there is a certain brokenness there. But the problem, the nature of the problem is not one of evil. It's not one of brokenness, but a problem of ignorance. Ignorance meaning a veil that is before our eyes. And when ignorance is supplanted by knowledge, when the lights are turned on, so to speak, then what has always been becomes apparent. So then one recognizes that nothing has ever been broken. It's always been whole. We just failed to recognize that as we stumbled our way through the dark room. We've bumped our head, we've caused suffering in the world, but that was all because of the fact that the lights were not turned on. And once we turn on the light, we recognize things are actually whole, and they've always been that way, right? So yes, I agree with you, and that's how I would characterize the difference in terms of the nature of the problem. There's the human condition is problematic on both ends, and I would venture to say that every religious tradition begins with the understanding that there's a problem in the human condition that we need to overcome. But how exactly you characterize that problem is, I think, where one sees the uniqueness and the beauty of every tradition, is that problem is characterized in very different ways. in different traditions.
Yeah. Would you call that Maya as well? Illusion?
Yeah.
Annalise has another question.
Sure.
So is the Socratic dialogue in Upanishad, no, so is the Socratic dialogue and Upanishad knockoff?
So, um, so one thing I forgot to mention in the answer to your question, despite the humorous nature of the question, I think it holds something serious in there, which is that just as historians see the Socratic dialogues as a turning point in the history of Western philosophy, so also historians have seen the Upanishadic dialogues as a turning point in the history of Indian philosophy, right? They change things so deeply that dialogue becomes the foundational way of having a philosophical discourse within Indian philosophy for millennia afterwards. So that's what a watershed moment both the Socratic dialogues and the Upanishadic dialogues are. Now, in terms of the connections between the ancient Greek world, the Greco-Roman world, and ancient India, there are some very tantalizing connections, and very much so. It's sadly something that has not been studied in the depth that it should, but there is clear indication that the ancient world was far more connected through travel, through trade, and the conveyance of ideas than we like to think of it, or that we realize. We think of the ancient world as sort of islands, as multiple islands. There's the Indus Valley, and there's India, and there's China, and then there's Greece and Rome, and there's Mesopotamia, and these are all sort of islands unto themselves. But that's not the reality. They may not have had the internet and email and social media, but the world was connected. It always has been a connected place, and ideas have passed freely from one part of the world to another.
I think Kelly Steiner had a question to ask.
Sure.
Perhaps reconsidering. You know, what's interesting, last week we studied Confucius, and some of these same truths were very present in his teachings, especially the idea that truth is more a matter of relational learning than it is, you know, accepting or rejecting a certain kind of philosophical proposition, you know, something like that. And really Christianity is all about how you relate to the neighbor, or how you relate to the God. But a lot of what came out of Greek philosophy is abstract and is kind of propositional. So does the Upanishads have a philosophy or a belief about how knowledge can transport across boundaries? That there's no real ownership of knowledge, that it's just kind of available for everyone? Is that?
So this has been a really tough thing in Indian history, is the question of ownership of knowledge, because I think this is that problematic area that I mentioned earlier, that the caste system has placed significant limitations on the dissemination and ownership of knowledge, and restricting both the appreciation and conveyance of knowledge to just a few. And there are signs that the Upanishads push back against that restriction in very significant ways, right? Not exactly in the ways we would speak about it in today's language, but nevertheless, in their own times, they represented, just like Buddhism did, a significant pushback against the priestly tradition, the Brahmanic tradition that was controlled by a few people as the keepers, disseminators, and teachers of that knowledge. And so there's a beautiful story in the Upanishads of a child who comes to learn and says to a famous teacher and says, "Sir, I want to be your student. I want to learn about Brahman, about ultimate reality." And the teacher says, "Sure, who's your father?" Now, that question is a loaded question, right? It identifies your lineage and your caste. And he says, well, let me go back and ask my mother. I don't know. And so he goes back home and asks his mother, and his mother is painfully honest. And she says, when you were a child, or before you were born, I knew many men, and I don't know who your father is. And so this name that you have, the last name you have, is just my name. That's all it is. So go tell your teacher this. And so he goes and he tells his teacher and says, I don't know, my mother doesn't know who my father is. And this is just my name. And the teacher is so impressed by this that he says that you, because of your honesty, show the two true characteristics of a Brahmin or someone who is wise. And you deserve to study this knowledge. So become my student. Go fetch firewood. You will be my student. Fetching firewood is a symbol of initiation in the Upanishads. So it's I mean, in the context of the times, this is a huge repudiation of the Vedic tradition that came before that, of the caste hierarchy. And casteism definitely doesn't die off after the Upanishad. It's still very much a problem to be struggled with today. But one of the things that makes the Upanishad so attractive is their sense of knowledge being something that ought to be widely accessible and owned by many. Even if they don't fully realize or articulate that vision, it's definitely present in the Upanishads, very much a contrast to their times. So this has been a tough question about the ownership of knowledge. If we're running out of time, Nathan, before we end, I just wanted to read one passage from the Taittiriya Upanishad that I think serves as a nice conclusion to the ethical theme of today's talk. And there are many things one could discuss in that passage, of course, like with all of any passage from these great works. But I think if we leave ourselves with some questions, that's maybe a nice thing. So it's like all these passages, it's just a paragraph here. So this is a speech that the teacher gives the student upon the conclusion of study. So this is a graduation speech that many of us have heard in our lives. So here goes, and I'll skip certain sections. It's only a couple paragraphs. Right here at number 11. This is the Taittiriya Upanishad. After the completion of Vedic study, the teacher admonishes his resident pupil. Speak the truth. So this is his message as he leaves the boarding school. Speak the truth. Follow the law. Do not neglect your private recitation of the Veda or scripture. After you have given a valuable gift to the teacher, do not cut off your family line. I always find this line really humorous because I think alumni contributions were important even way back 2,500 years ago, right? So the teacher is saying, hey, don't forget my salary. Then he goes on, do not neglect the truth. That point of truth keeps emerging. Do not neglect the law. Do not neglect your health. Do not neglect your wealth. Do not neglect your private and public recitation of the Veda. Do not neglect the rights to the gods and ancestors. Right, so some really fundamental principles here, very beautiful. And then the most famous ethical passage in the Upanishads. Treat your mother like God. Treat your father like a god. Treat your teacher like a god. Treat your guests like gods. And the word for guests here is atiti in Sanskrit, which technically means the uninvited guest. So not the one you actually call for dinner and want to spend time with, but the person who shows up at your door uncalled for, right? Uninvited. And then I'll skip here. You should give with faith and never without faith. You should give with dignity. You should give with modesty. You should give with trepidation. You should give with comprehension. Now, if you ever have a doubt regarding a rite or a practice, should there be experienced, qualified, and gentle Brahmins or teachers devoted to the law who are able to make a judgment in that matter, you should observe how they act in that regard and behave likewise. This is the last thing I'm going to say here in today's talk, is to say, when you hear the first part of this sentence, if there is a learned teacher and you've got a question or a doubt, if you have a learned teacher, we would finish that sentence by saying, go ask their advice and do what they say. But that's not what the teacher says here. He says, you should observe how they act and behave likewise. So you find someone trustworthy, don't just hear what they have to say, but look at how they act in the world. And this is one of those beautiful fundamental principles of the Upanishads, that knowledge is marked not so much by how much you know, by the content you have, but the character that you embody, the way you live your life. That's what is the marker of knowledge, of truth, the presence of truth, fundamentally. Yes, the content is important. You got to know your Vedic rites, and you've got to know the hymns, and you have to recite them every day. But if you have a doubt, go to someone, not someone who knows those recitations, but someone who behaves, who acts in the right way, and then follow how they act in the world. So I'll end on that note as food for thought. And I just want to thank you again, Nathan, and I want to thank our audience that have stayed a full 15 minutes beyond our scheduled time to listen to this discussion. Thank you to the audience for that those great questions and answers.
Thank you very much, Ravi Gupta. This has been a feast of spirituality and ethical understanding, and hopefully we can take this back into our lives and be aware of it and focus on it. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And we hope to see you again.
I hope so too. It's a pleasure.